Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and if folks come in, we'll just let them join us. But welcome to our 7th week of Creation and Covenant, our summer Genesis Bible study. So we are in the part of Genesis, which takes up the majority of Genesis, but of the patriarchs. And so we're kind of switching now fully into the Jacob story. Abraham's death was mentioned last time we read, and since that time, some things have happened. So briefly, in the chapter before chapter 28, chapter 27, we have the infamous story of the stealing of the blessing. Isaac is at the end of his life, and he's going to bless his oldest son Esau, and Rebekah and Jacob. It's at the prompting of Rebekah, but Jacob takes part in it, obviously. Go through this kind of this trick to basically trick the old and near blind Isaac into thinking that Jacob is Esau. And they do that by bringing him a stew of domestic animal, which Isaac had just asked Esau to go get him wild game. And we remember that's kind of a weakness of his of sorts. And so Jacob gets this stew, and he puts on basically goat fur on his hands and his neck, and he wears his brother's clothing. And his dad is suspicious, and yet he smells Esau on the clothing, and he feels the hairiness of Esau's hands. And so he blesses Jacob. I'm getting all these names mixed up. The further along we get in this story, the more there are. And so anyhow, Jacob has stolen the blessing as he had kind of traded for the birthright earlier on. I told y'all last week there's a linguistic similarity in the words for blessing and for birthright in Hebrew. It's like I don't remember this off the top of my head. It's like Bekorah and Barakah, I think. It's something to that extent, but they're very similar sounding. And so the sound there would pick up if you're hearing this in the original language. Anyhow, Esau's just mad as all get out. And so Jacob becomes a fugitive of sorts. He's running away from his brother. He's on the run. He's in exile. And so that's kind of where we come in today. Our story that we're going to pay attention to predominantly today begins at verse 10 of chapter 28. But I want to just take some time and look at the first 9 verses before we get into that story. And so I'll read this. And so I'll just start with 28. Now, chapter 28 just kind of jumps into the story. And so that's why I wanted to give you this kind of recounting of 27, because it's important to know where we're situated. Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him, "You shall not marry one of the Canaanite women. Go at once to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and numerous, that you may have a company of peoples. May he give to you the blessing of Abraham, to you and to your offspring with you, so that you may take possession of the land where you now live as an alien, land that God gave to Abraham." Thus Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Paddan Aram to Laban, son of Bethuel the Aramean, the brother of Rebekah, Jacob and Esau's mother. This is important because this story seems to conflict with what just happened before. As we know, there are different kind of threads of the tradition that are weaved together to make up the story of Genesis. And so we have one story where, where Jacob has essentially duped his dad into giving the blessing, and now we see the dad doesn't really care and is giving the blessing of sorts. So there's a kind of conflict here. If you read 27 and then jump into 28, it sounds kind of like, where's the tension that was in 27? That seems to have dissipated. Another point to bring up is this reiteration that we saw when Abraham sent out his servant to find a wife for Isaac of do not marry a Canaanite woman. There's this sense that the promise that has been made is tied deeply to not marrying Canaanites, to not marrying outside of the kind of familial system. And in our day and age, in the melting pot of America, that is something we don't lift up. It's something we kind of abhor, this idea that marriage should be pure. I was really helped in thinking through this by Walter Brueggemann, who in his commentary on Genesis, I think he mentions this in the 27th chapter of his commentary. He points out that in this day and age, when there's tension and violence against different tribes or families, when there is a sense that your tribe could be lost forever, there's an importance of keeping the lineage going, because that lineage could be lost at any moment. And what is lost with that lineage is the family story, is the history, is the culture, is the society, is the religion. And so you see that struggle throughout the Old Testament, right? When the Jewish people are under captivity in Babylon, it's really important that they don't intermarry. And it's not as much because, not that they loved the Babylonians, but it was more that they could lose their traditions and just become a kind of like a syncretism could arise, and their religions would get lost. And so while I wouldn't say we should adhere to that kind of view of marriage and of purity, I do think it makes sense in a historical context, and is important to point out why this is such a kind of repeating call throughout. And then moving to verse 6. Now Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Paddan Aram to take a wife from there. And that as he blessed him, he charged him, "You shall not marry one of the Canaanite women." And that Jacob had obeyed his father, and his mother had gone to Paddan Aram. So when Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please his father Isaac, Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, daughter of Abraham's son Ishmael, and daughter of Naboth, and sister of Naboth, to be his wife in addition to the wives he had. Esau is essentially saying, oh, that's not what you want? Well, then that's what I'm going to do. Because Esau feels scorned, he feels left out, he feels pushed out in a way. If you read chapter 27, there's this just heart-rending scene where Esau's like, you have to have another blessing. There's got to be another blessing. And he's like, well, I already gave the blessing to Isaac. There's nothing I can do. And he's like, please, there has to be another blessing. And the text says, and Esau lifted up his voice and wept. And eventually Isaac blesses him. But this is the blessing he gets. See, away from the fatness of the earth shall your home be, and away from the dew of the heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck. So the blessing that Esau gets is not a blessing you want. Away from the dew of heaven, away from the fatness of the earth. He's essentially getting a counter blessing that his brother got and saying, you will live by the sword. And so we have this figure of Esau, and we won't talk about Esau anymore, but I want you to just kind of think about how he figures in this story today. He's behind the scenes, but he's essentially the reason Jacob's on the run. And he's essentially kind of cast himself off from the family. The text mentions, I think at the end of chapter 26, that he had married Hittite women. So he's already married women outside of the kind of familial system. And now he's gone even further. And though Ishmael is in the family by some means, he's also outside of it because Ishmael stands for another nation. So there's all this kind of contrast between Esau essentially didn't do anything wrong up front, right? He might have been dumb about selling away his birthright, but his blessing was stolen. And yet, God seems to favor Jacob. And then Esau kind of has made his bed and just says, well, I'm just going to do what they don't want. So that's something to think about, this kind of tragic figure of Esau. I don't want to spend any more time on that because I think the focus for our day will be Jacob's dream at Bethel. And so I'd like to get into that. And Aaron, would you be up for reading verses 10 through 17?
Yep.
And Faye, would you read 18 through 22?
Jacob, can you hear me? Yeah. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven.
And Jacob rose up early in the morning and took the stone that he had put for his pillows and set it up for a pillar and poured oil upon the top of it. And he called the name of that place Bethel. And the name of that city was called Luz at the first. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. And this stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this is a familiar story. A lot of these stories we're reading this summer are ones that we have heard since childhood. And obviously the kind of stairway to heaven imagery or Jacob's dream is one that's familiar and has kind of transcended the Jewish Christian tradition. You see this outside. There's some kind of, I think it's from the 90s. There's this corny country song called Jacob's Ladder that you might have heard. I always think of that song, but it has nothing to do with this besides this guy has a ladder and goes and sees this girl he's in love with. But the point being is that this story has kind of ingrained itself into the culture outside of just a religious use. That's like many of the stories. You know, and soon we'll read the one of Jacob wrestling with the man/angel/God at night at Penuel. And so I think it's important to think about how we're affected by the reading of this story, by what we bring to it, right? All the art and the story and the history and even our lessons as children in Sunday school. And I say that because I think our familiarity with this story can often be a hindrance. And I know I say this a lot, but it's so important to kind of slow down and listen and think through kind of in a new, fresh way about what's going on here. One thing I think is important is we can get kind of sucked in by the imagery, by the beauty, by just the imaginative evocation of a ladder coming down from heaven or a stairway. But I think what's happening more in this story and what's more important is what God is saying. There's something that God is saying here that is both common to the patriarchs and unique to Jacob. And so I'll point that out in a second. But just kind of think through, how is this story speaking anew to you, and how can you hear it anew? One thing to point out is that Jacob's story is largely framed by incidents that happen at night and that are essentially contacts with God. And so we have Bethel here in 28, and then later in 32 is Penuel, which is where he wrestles with the angel/God. And so I'm really intrigued by this because both of these happen at night. And Jacob is a trickster figure of sorts. He's kind of this mischievous. I mean, you can kind of pick a word for him, but he's not kind of a run-of-the-mill, upright, blameless, righteous Abraham figure, however you want to describe him. And it's interesting to me that his meetings with God are at night. We can think about the symbolism around that. There's a kind of hidden, a mystery. There's also a kind of maybe like a terror of sorts. There's a tradition in the mystical tradition in Christianity of the dark night of the soul, and the imagery there is that a period in the spiritual life entails a wrestling with God, maybe a feeling of God's absence, but it's marked by this sense of night, the symbolism of that. And I want us to think about, why is Jacob typically meeting God at night? So Jacob leaves and he comes to a place and he lays down on a stone. This is a big stone. It's not a little stone. And it's weird that he makes his pillow out of this stone. But there's a symbolism to that, right? Stones mark something sacred. And he will later stand the stone upright to make it a marker of this place, of Bethel. Bethel is mentioned in Genesis 12. Abraham goes to a place, I think it says west, or it's either west or east of Bethel. So this is, when the people are writing it, Bethel was deeply ingrained in their tradition and their language. And so this is a place that would have been well known to hearers of this scripture. I want to read verse 11 again. Listen to how many times I say the word place. He came to a certain place and stayed there for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. The word place shows up 3 times in this verse, in verse 11. Your translation might have it different, but that word in Hebrew, place, can also mean shrine. But it's like the word pneuma. So when we hear the word pneuma, as it's translated in Greek, great example of this is John 3. It can be translated as wind, as breath, or as spirit. And so when a Greek would have heard the word pneuma, they would have had to discern what word is being used there, but also there's an ambiguity between the words, right? We in English are very particular about our words. And so this word spirit means spirit, but pneuma meant many things. And that's like this word place. Place means just a place, a location, but it also means shrine. And later in Jewish tradition, it was also used for synagogues. So a synagogue could be called place. So think about the kind of bells that would be ringing if you heard this story. It's foreshadowing that's a shrine, and in the context of the readers, it's evoking, oh, this is a holy place, like our synagogues are. It would be like if we had a word that stood for church, holy place, and altar all together, or table as we're reformed. So while he's there, Jacob has a dream. And I think this is another thing to point out. We hear this as a dream, but God speaks to it. So this isn't a normal dream. This isn't like the dream I had last night. For y'all that just joined, I had a dream, a COVID dream last night. It was more of a little minor nightmare. But the point being is it's not a normal everyday dream. There is something specific happening here. And the line between vision, epiphany, revelation, and dream is blurred. And this vision, this dream is, there's different translations. Does anyone have, so I have ladder on my translation. Who has a different translation? Go ahead and unmute yourself and just say it out loud. Whoever, if you have a different one.
Adler has ramp.
Ramp, that's a great one. Anyone else? I know stairway is another one.
Yeah.
So the thing to think about is the Ziggurats that would have been in Mesopotamia and surrounding areas. They were like these, steep steps, right, that went up. And they that's kind of what it is. It's not a ladder in the way we would think of like rungs of a ladder and you climb up. It's more of like a staircase or a ramp. It's something kind of ascending to heaven. I want to show you, if you can hold on one second, some visual images of this. So I'm going to share my screen with y'all for just a second. So this is Raphael's depiction of this, and this is a fresco, and you can see he's sleeping on a rock, and there's this stairwell. So it's not a ladder, it's a stairwell, and we can see it's kind of ascending. There's some stuff in the background, and then we can imagine this is God, right? And there's these angels, and the angels are winged, which wouldn't have been how ancient Hebrew imagined them. They were more just kind of divine messengers. And then here is Chagall's image of this. This isn't a good one of it. It's hard to see, but there's a bird right here, and then various angels and angels in the background. And there is a ladder. Jacob's right here in the red, and then there's this kind of whole other side happening here with this this winged angel creature here. And then we've seen that. This is one from the Vatican. Again, it's a stairwell. Angels up and down the stairwell, and God up here at the top, and Jacob. The thing I like about this is I feel like this one really captures the dream scenario, because you'll see the scale. Jacob's actually larger than the stairway, and if it was a stairway to heaven, it would obviously be huge, right? So I always see this one as one really capturing the kind of dream imagery here. And then lastly, there's William Blake's. Let me make this a little bigger. I'm a big fan of Blake. But you can see Jacob's down here on a stone, and there's this spiral staircase. For you science nerds out there, what comes to mind with spiral is DNA, right? And the spiral has long symbolized life, even predating, obviously Blake would have predated the discovery of DNA. And you can see there's figures up and down. The thing I like about Blake is the staircase has angels, and some of them are winged and some of them aren't. And you can see it's going up and up and up, and then eventually goes into a sun to God. And then the beauty of the stars in the background kind of symbolizing night and his dream. Those are just a few of the many artistic depictions of this, but I always like to see when these are available, just to kind of imagine what's going on. Okay, I said the vision is important, but it's not the important part, right? What's important in this story, the central part of this story, is what God says out of this dream. I'm going to just read the 3 verses from 13 to 15. Verse 13 and 14. And the Lord stood beside him and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. And your offspring shall be like the dust of earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you and in your offspring. This is almost becoming rote for us. We've heard this covenant promise numerous times. That's not to demean its importance, but it's something that we've heard routinely. I want to point out one thing. This is a routine thing, but we have to remember, Jacob stole. He didn't bargain or trade. He stole this birthright with the prompting of blessing with the prompting of his mother. And yet, God has determined it to be so that he gets this patriarchal blessing. And so it's really important that God says, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. Jacob is being brought into this lineage of blessing, of the patriarchs, of covenant. And so we have Jacob, this kind of misfit, mischievous, this trickster person, being brought into the promise. No one's perfect, and Jacob sure isn't. And so that's an interesting thing to think about. And also the contrast with Esau. In that day and age, this should have been Esau. And so God is disrupting cultural norms and also moral norms, I would argue, in a way, because Jacob kind of got his blessing deceitfully, and yet God has blessed him. verse 15 is the change. There's something new here. This is unique to Jacob, this promise that God makes to Jacob. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And then this is where Jacob waits. This is such an essential promise. This is deeply within us as Christians to believe that God is present, that God is with us, that God goes with us, that God cares for us. But this is new. God has promised offspring to be their God, but this promise that God will be with him, that God will go with him is new. This is a unique thing. And I think the stairway is such an important part of that, right? Remember at the end of the Gospels when Jesus dies and the veil at the temple is ripped, and it's this symbolizing that what separates us from God is gone, that God is with us in a way we could never have imagined beforehand. I think you're seeing a prefiguring of that and a revelation of that, maybe to a lesser extent here, with this connection, right? Jacob is in exile. He's running. The only thing on his mind is survival. He has not come to this place for religious reasons. He's not coming here expecting anything of an epiphany or a revelation. He's simply avoiding his brother. And God appears to him. And the way God appears to him is this connection between heaven and earth, right? The ladder, the stairway, the ramp. And that symbolizes that God is not far from us, that God is not some distant God, but this is the personal God, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, the God that connects to us, the God that cares for us, the God that goes with us. And I can't overemphasize how important that is. Walter Brueggemann says, this is the incarnation prefigured. The incarnation is God with us in the most material, earthly way possible. And he points out in John 1, when Jesus says, you will see angels descending up and down upon the Son of Man. And so it's this idea that Jesus ultimately is Jacob's ladder in a much deeper way. I think it's the other thing that's important is the beauty of this story is Jacob experiences God at this specific place, and yet God is telling him, I will go with you wherever you are. And so we're moving beyond the kind of cultic religion of that day, where God existed only in these kind of sacred spots where shrines were put up. And this God is saying, I am not like those gods. I am beyond those gods. I am a God that goes everywhere, that follows you. And this isn't a God that simply you have to appease and then that God brings rain and fertility. This is a God that makes promises to humans. I've been thinking about this. I've taught this class before. Many of y'all have taken it before, but I am struck in this passage by maybe this is where the covenant reaches its high point. That covenant promise, right? Because we always associate it with this sense of the generations that will come after and the giving of the land, the promised land. But I'm wondering too, is this incorporation of the promise to be with you the high point of the covenant? And I'm interested what y'all think of that. Jacob rises early in the morning. He makes this, he marks this with the pillow that he slept on as a sacred spot. This isn't denying that there are sacred spots that are, in a way, God is more present or more known. It's not getting rid of that, but saying that God is also a God that accompanies, a God that follows, a God that is everywhere. And so Jacob does this ritualistic marking of this spot, and Faye read this, but in verse 19 it says he called that place Bethel, house of God, but the name of the city was Luz at first. So there's an indication here that this might have been a shrine before from another religious tradition, but Jacob is marking it, and it's becoming a new place. Jacob will return to this place later. Now, this is typical Jacob here in verse 20. Listen to how Jacob makes his part of the covenant. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and the stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will surely give 1/10 to you. There's a huge, giant, big if at the beginning of that, right? If Abraham was saying that, he would just say, and I will do this, and I will be, you will be my God, and I will go and do this. Jacob, Brueggemann calls him a bargain hunter. Jacob says, if. And so I think that's such a beautiful depiction in one word of who Jacob is. Regardless of how you kind of imagine Jacob, Jacob is not Abraham. And the other thing about it, though, that I think is important and good for us to think about theologically is covenant entails relationship, and covenant entails responsibility. And while we typically think of that as a responsibility, the onus on the part of the humans, there is an expectation that God is not some distant, absent God, but rather that God is involved, that God is essentially playing God's part in this covenant promise. I have been thinking about sacred places a lot, and I want to share one for me, and I'd love it if y'all either in the course of our conversation or email shared some with me, but I want to share one of mine with y'all. So there is a place in Tennessee. I worked at this park, and when I was doing my master's of forestry research at University of Kentucky, I actually did my research at this park. This is a natural arch that happens over time, and there's actually two of them connected to each other. It's called Twin Arches, and it's north of Knoxville in Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area. I can't speak. This is one of the smaller ones. I want to show you the bigger one. So here's my wife, Taylor, who most of y'all know, standing. So you can see Taylor here, and this is the arch above her, all this. I mean, they're just gigantic. And what happens is you just hike out of the middle of the woods. You're just hiking, and all of a sudden, these just kind of pop up out of nowhere. And they're just these beautiful arches. I believe the Cherokee were in this area, and these were considered holy areas to them. They would meet here. They would have meetings. They would make decisions, and they were just a very important place to them, a sacred place. Now, the cool thing about this is you can actually hike to the top of it. And when you get to the top, this is what you see. You see just miles and miles of the Cumberland Plateau, and this doesn't, I mean, I can't articulate how far you can see, and it's all wilderness. You're in the middle of the park, and the park's hundreds of thousands of acres, and you can see for miles, and you get to see all these ridge lines. So this is part of the large Cumberland Plateau, which stretches south of Pennsylvania all the way into Alabama, and it's once you get up to the heights, it's very flat, but you can see these ridge lines just all around you and just green trees. Here's another view of it. But I've always just considered this such a holy place to me. It's just a gorgeous place to see those arches and to be struck by them, and then to go and climb on top of them and have that kind of view you couldn't imagine when you're down there. It's just a holy experience for me. And I think it's important to think about things like that in this story. Where are places or moments where you have felt most close to God, and why? That's something I'm thinking about with this passage. God is a God that is everywhere, that is always present. And yet there are places or people or moments when we have felt closer to God. A couple other quick things I'm thinking through. Esau, who I mentioned earlier, the night I mentioned earlier. Why is Jacob meeting God constantly at night, or predominantly at night? Blurring of the line between dreams and theophany. God is appearing, and yet it's appearing in a dream. And so are there ways that God appears to us that we might not be opening ourselves to or thinking through? I read somewhere that folks used to go into the temple or to synagogues and just sleep, expecting a holy dream to occur. That's not, how many of y'all have gone into the sanctuary at Palmacia and taken a nap? But why not, right? Why don't we do that? I think this story speaks to us that God is present, but yet I don't think we fully expect that presence, right? We expect God to be present in ways of when we pray and things like that, but are we opening ourselves to the vivid dreams of Jacob, to these hit me over the head, eye-opening revelations? The other thing I want to lift up is, and this is something Brueggemann hits over the head, is Jacob is escaping Esau, and he is not in a religious mode here. He's in an escape or survival mode. And there's a social historian named Christopher Lasch. He's most known for his book, The Culture of Narcissism, but he wrote another book called The Minimal Self. And one of the points he makes in that book is that modern day society has become so obsessed with survival. I've got to make enough to live. I've got to make enough to buy this house. I've got to make enough to get my kids to this school, And life becomes, I've just got to. And it becomes this kind of survival ethic. And what Lasch says is we're missing out on the richness and the depth of life by existing in this kind of survival mindset. And so part of that is to be open to the possibility of something bigger than what's presenting itself to us in that moment. And so I'm wondering about that. How does this, again, speak to this theme of life in the midst of scarcity, abundance in the midst of scarcity, life in the face of death? And lastly, choice. Jacob has been chosen by God here. Jacob has stolen the blessing, but he's not in the mindset at the beginning to think about that. He's simply kind of evading his brother, and God appears to Jacob in a dream and says, you are the next one in this line of Abraham and Isaac and now Jacob. And remember, Jacob becomes Israel. And so Jacob makes that choice. He counters it in this kind of sneaky way, right? If you do this, verse 21 says, then you will be my God. But still, there is a sense of choice there. There is a decision that should be made. So there is a transformative moment, the dream, and yet it still entails a choice. And I think that's so important for us to remember, because God comes to us, but we still have to make that choice of faith, that choice of hope, that choice of love. So I've talked too much as always, and I want to turn it over now to y'all and ask what questions, thoughts, reflections do you have?
Will?
Yes.
A couple of things. Having been born in the early 1940s, I was going to church camp in the mid 1950s. And at night, we would get around a campfire and often sing, "We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder." Very emotional. I got to seminary, and there was a professor who basically insisted we never, ever let people sing that song because it's heretical. It's Gnostic. Gnosticism meaning I can be closer to God than you based if I know more than you do. Then I started looking at the song, and it really distorts the message. It isn't "we are climbing." That's not what it says. God is descending and ascending. So that's just a little, I grew up loving that song. It was, one of the pleasant memories. And then to have a seminary professor say, "Don't you ever let a kid sing that song. You will teach some bad theology." And the other thing, and I think you've made this point, the Jewish Publication Society very eloquently insists that the Bible is not making moral judgments in this story. In all of these stories, it's telling, I think you've said that already, that it's telling the story and leaving it to us to moralize if we want to.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the point you were making about the ladder is great, because I think that's the whole thing of the incarnation, right? Is we're not building a ziggurat up to God or a Tower of Babel. God is coming to us. God is seeking us out. God is seeking Jacob out. God is seeking David out. I mean, these characters that we would not want dating our daughters are the people that God chooses, right? And that's something to think about. And not only chooses, but seeks out. Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Kelly?
Yeah, I wanted to say one thing about the song. Also, it's a spiritual song. So it was first sung by the slave community during the Civil War, and then as white people we've taken it over as a camp song and all of that. But so there's other meanings behind it that are very multicultural or whatnot.
Thanks, Kelly. That's an important thing to think through, and the beauty of interpretation, right? That stories can have multiple meanings and interpretations, and some of them can be good, and some of them can be bad, and some of them can just be, whatever they are. But it's interesting to think about the history of that song and the context of this story. Thanks. Who else? Y'all are very quiet today. Well, let me ask you a question. Where are places that you have known God, or moments that you have known God, and why were those places or moments special? Because oftentimes we can go to a place, for instance, Taylor surprised me for my birthday back in 2017 and said, she gave me my birthday card, and I opened it up, and it was a ticket to go to Big South Fork. I hadn't been there in 10 years since I had last gone there to do research for my my thesis. And I was just struck and in awe. And I said, we were only going up for a couple days, and I said, whatever we do, we have to go to Twin Arches. I want to climb on top of Twin Arches. That's all I want to do. And we did that, and I got up there, and it was like, there was no, I had so many beautiful moments up there, and I was just kind of standing there, and I was like, wanting like something to happen, right? And so I just sat there, and Taylor and I settled down, and Taylor was sketching. She's an artist, and she was drawing, and I was sitting there just quiet for 20 or so minutes looking out. And this peace came over me that was like, you idiot, it doesn't have to be a big moment every time, right? It can just be resting here, knowing God is here, that this is a special place, even if it doesn't feel over the top special. But where are those places or moments for you, and why? Why are they special? What makes them different? Betsy?
This may sound kind of crazy, but I have felt close to God when I feel like I've been extremely thankful, or when I feel like there's been like a miracle in my life. Each time when I had my children, I can remember holding them in my arms for the first time, and it was I just was caught by the beauty of a new life and me holding a life. And then also at my dad's funeral service, there was just such joy that afterwards I just was so thankful. I just felt like God is in this place. And I just felt joy.
Thanks for sharing that. Those it's nice to hear you talk about moments as opposed to places, because I think that's an important thing to think through too. How God can be almost more present in specific moments than others.
Since we're on, I'm going to mention one of mine. And it really, when we were in Uganda, and we've been there 5 times, It's just when I'm there, everything's natural. There are no cars, no radios. The children come running down barefoot. Everything's natural. People happy. I just feel very close to God there for some reason. And I've told them that when I'm there, I feel very close to God.
Thanks for sharing that. That reminds me of, I actually with PCPC went to Mexico as a teenager, and you get in your mind that you're going to be the missionary and go help these people, and they end up being the missionary to you, because you realize how happy they are amidst what we would consider poverty and deprivation. And there's just a joy there that I was shocked by as a teenager, and just the kind of arrogance of thinking that we're going to bring them something. It's a good lesson for us to learn. Anyone else want to share any places or moments? I have other questions if y'all are going to be quiet today.
Well,
Yes.
being as introverted and shy as I am, I hate this job, but real quickly, a couple things. For about a dozen years for the presbytery, I led backpacking trips on the Appalachian Trail, and we would, the last day, whitewater raft, the Chattooga River. There were many times there, and I could identify with that. The other thing I would say quickly, and I will not give the details because it's very personal, I'm a bit of a skeptic about people having visions and dreams and so forth. But I can tell you, there was one time at a particularly difficult point in my life when in a dream, I was led to a whole new experience of the grace of God. Again, I'm not going to give the details, but it still lingers with me how powerfully I experienced grace in that very, actually traumatic, frightening dream. But it was a sense when I woke up, I knew things were going to be okay and that God was with me. And this is a skeptic.
Thanks for sharing that, and also being upfront and honest about your skepticism. I think that's the challenge of these texts, right? Is to say that God is still alive and present and active. And in our modern age, in the scientific age, and this isn't me bashing science, but rather just to say science cannot explain everything, and God is present and speaks to us in ways sometimes we couldn't even imagine. Who else?
Well,
Kim?
the three places that I think of, but two of them are associated with St. Francis. In Assisi itself, not the big cathedral that's dedicated to him because he would hate it, but there is a little tiny church in the top of the city that is so St. Francis, and it's where he used to preach. And the other place associated with him is La Verna, which was a monastery that was given to him by one of his followers, and it's where he received the stigmata. And when you go there, you have to be in silence as you walk around. It is one of the holiest places I've ever been. It just has a holiness feeling about it. The third place was in Nepal, and it was at a stupa. I mean, it was a wrong religion, but it felt so holy when I was there. I just thought it was really interesting.
I'm glad you mentioned that feeling of holiness. I always feel this when I go to St. Leo's, the Benedictine monastery, just north of here. And I always tell folks there's this passage in Thomas Merton's autobiography where he talks about monastics, whether nuns or monks, but their practice of prayer, and that they're like a light beam emitted from this place, and it almost like affects the grounds, the building, the sanctuary where they are. I go to St. Leo's, and it doesn't matter what mood I'm in. As soon as I get there and start walking around, I get this feeling that this is a holy place, and it's almost like these people have made it holy in a way. Rich, did I see your hand? You're muted.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Dennis's comment about Uganda reminded me of an experience that I had. My brother and I were on a camping safari in Kenya, and we camped on the Mara River. And we got to the campsite about 4 hours late. We were rendezvousing with another group. And so as we started to set up the camp, it rained. And it rained before we had the tent set up, before we could dig the latrines, before we could get the flies on the tents. And so all the sleeping bags, all the tents, everything was soaked. It rained. And so we spent the night, in damp, in the sleeping bags with the rain dripping down from the tents. And it was a pretty miserable night. That was the first night there. And I really thought, why am I here? This is not good, not fun. We got up before the sun rose the next morning because we were cold. We built a fire down on the cliff overlooking the Mara River. And we had solar water heaters, which we used to make coffee. We drug our chairs down by the campfire and drank our warm coffee. And as the sun came up over the horizon in the east, over Kenya's horizon, it was warm, and it was warming and very comfortable. And just as the sun broke over the horizon, 3 giraffes walked in front of the sun on the other bank of the river. And I thought to myself, that's why we're here. I felt very close, very spiritual at that time, at that moment.
That's a powerful image, Rich. Thanks for sharing.
Well, I'll share one as well. I think as most folks probably know or might know, I recently traveled what I thought was going to be by myself for 6 months, kind of variety of places. But one of the first places I started off was at Taizé, and which is a monastery in France. And so the presence of God was there, I think, more than I had realized it would be, in nature, in prayer, in worship. It was amazing. But the theme of Taizé, so the way Taizé works each year, they pick a theme and then they teach that theme each week throughout the year. So you go and you stay for 7 days and they teach that. And the theme for 2019 was hospitality. And so there was the whole focus was on hospitality. And what struck me, I think more often than not throughout this trip, is how much I had prepared myself to be alone for 6 months, and how in the beginning of this trip, God basically was so present, especially at Taizé, and especially in learning about hospitality. And then somehow that theme carried out throughout my entire trip, whereby I lived with Marsha's daughter and son-in-law in Uganda for a couple months and worked with them at Hack, and they became lifelong friends, people I didn't know. I met people everywhere I went. Wojtek and Merrick and I are now super close as well, from being with them in Poland. I had friends fly over and meet me in Europe. My parents met me. So it struck me, I think, more than I had realized how much God is just part of all of that. And he's part of the community. And I don't know, it felt like it was a continuous religious experience when I had entered this experience thinking that I was going to be alone for 6 months. And I ended up having to actually seek out alone time, which was pretty amazing. So anyways, I think that for me, that was just a transformative 6 months, and just God's presence was there more than I think it's ever been in my life.
Yeah, that's so similar to Jacob too, right? It's not the expectation that you bring to it. God kind of upsets the expectation, and it's the kind of recurring theme is there's an expectation of scarcity, or survival or death. And God brings life. God brings, abundance. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. We have just a couple minutes left, and unless anyone wanted to share a place or a moment, I wanted to ask a quick question about Jacob. And how do you see the person of Jacob, and why is God working through this person? Remember the oracle that God gives to Rebekah at 25:23. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The elder shall serve the younger. And so there's this expectation from the very get-go that the cultural norms are going to be upset. And this younger one, regardless of who or how he turns out to be, is the chosen one, is the one that will carry on the covenantal promise. How do y'all see Jacob so far?
Betsy, you're muted, Betsy.
Unmute. Okay.
You're unmuted now.
Okay. The thought that came to me is God molds us through our experiences. And Jacob started out as this whippersnapper who I think had a lot of personality, a lot of potential. And through all of the challenges and difficulties, he had to work for 7 years after marrying the first wife to get his true heartbeat love. But I just think God makes us into the people that he knows we can be. Well, we choose to accept the challenges. But I think Jacob always had a lot of potential. He's probably very smart. He was driven. And I think God used that person. God made him into the person by the experiences that he went through. And God was there to guide him and prepare him for the rest of his life.
Thanks. Yeah, that theme of choice, right? God's choosing Jacob, and yet Jacob is having to choose too, is an interesting one. Marcia?
I take great comfort in the fact that God has chosen a very flawed human being. There's room for him to work with us and to use us for his kingdom, notwithstanding the obvious and maybe not so obvious flaws in our own character.
Yeah, there's definitely good news there. Thanks. Any last comments or thoughts before we close?
I had one thing that was not exactly on topic, but maybe, I love reading all this historical stuff.
I do.
So one of the several Bibles I read for, had a note on Ziggurats. Ziggurats were, they were sort of solid buildings. They didn't have any inside. They were just mud brick. Some were 60 feet high, some were as high as 200 feet. And these are the ones that have been found by archaeologists. But what they had on the top was a mini apartment. It had a bed, and I don't think it had running water or anything, nothing that flushed, but nobody had such things. But it was a place where they thought the deity could come down. There was no worship in the ziggurat. Usually next to the ziggurat, they built the temple. And so there was this ramp so that God could come visit the people, really. People didn't go up it. So that may be a little bit more like incarnation than, what you're thinking about. And the idea of God's messengers going up and down would fit in. So it was not a huge departure from the contemporary cultural existing thoughts. He didn't just dream this completely outside of something he had seen, because they still see some of those. So that sort of changed my view a little bit, knowing a little bit more about what the ziggurat was. And all the books indicate that this probably was the kind of ramp that you would have seen on a ziggurat.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That's interesting. The little apartment at the top's kind of funny to think about. Yeah, the
They didn't
gods
call
would
it that.
visit. The gods would visit. I was trying to make the contrast being that God is present outside of the
Exactly.
stairways and everything. But that's an important point to point out, that the gods would visit.
Right. And I think you're right. The step that Jacob took was not the angels coming up and down. It's the fact that God's everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the promise that God makes to Jacob and that Jacob reiterates, Brueggemann points out there's a similarity between that and Psalm 23. That kind of idea of God pursuing the believer, the church, the synagogue, everyone, that God comes after us, follows us, pursues us. Okay, I'm going to stop because we are over time, but before we go, let us share in our benediction together. Let us go from this place remembering God's words to Jacob. I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, or the God of Rebekah. Know that I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Let us go from this place, proclaiming Jacob's words. Surely the Lord is in this place. Amen. It's nice to share in the benediction after we read that chapter. It gives it a little more heft and depth to it. Friends, have a good week. I will see you next Sunday, if not before, and thank y'all so much for joining.